Hi, welcome to this recording. My name is Mirjam Luiten and I am a toxicologist at the RIVM, also known as the Dutch National Institute for Public Health and the Environment. In this video, I will tell you more about the ASPA, a workflow for next generation risk assessment. As you may know, next generation risk assessment has been a popular theme since the publication of new concepts such as toxicity testing in the 21st century and Risk 21. And these concepts, which are quite similar in design, are aimed at the development of a new approach to chemical risk assessment. That is an approach that is based on human relevant mechanisms and that is no longer reliant on testing in experimental animals. And over the years, a large number of case studies has been carried out demonstrating the applicability of next generation risk assessment, but also its associated level of protection and the challenges encountered. And together, this has resulted in a growing confidence in next generation risk assessment as the way forward with different stakeholders. And that is reflected by, for example, the transition plans of global regulatory agencies. Each of the aspects that I just mentioned, so the availability of sound concepts for next generation risk assessment, the case studies demonstrating its applicability, as well as the increasing confidence with stakeholders, they are all very important for bringing next generation risk assessment to life. Having that said though, we should also reflect on the limited progress we're making in terms of implementation, and we should reflect on the challenges that still need to be tackled. And within Risk Hunter, within the ASPIS cluster, we have the feeling that we have spent sufficient time on thinking about what could be in the near future. Instead, we should put our feet on the ground and take the next step. When talking about bringing next generation risk assessment to life, it is important that we discriminate between the how and the what. So let's first talk about the how. Well, for that, we need a roadmap that is preferably developed in co-creation and that is adopted by all stakeholders. And to facilitate the implementation of such a roadmap, it should be accompanied by a clear action plan with a well-defined ownership, meaning who is primarily responsible for each action. And as you may know, this is work in progress because the European Commission is developing a roadmap for phasing out animal testing for chemical safety assessment. And that roadmap is being developed in close collaboration with many stakeholders, including the Partnership on the Risk Assessment of Chemicals, also known as PARC. So let's move on to the what. What exactly do we aim for? Well, what we aim for is a system with many different goals and many different features. First of all, it is a system that should ensure the protection of human health. A system that is ethically justifiable as well as applicable for different jurisdictions and different regulations. The system should be mechanism-based, meaning it should be driven by our current knowledge of toxicological pathways. It should also be feasible to apply by making use of a sufficient but not an endless number of new approach methodologies. It should be feasible in terms of data integration and data interpretation, and it should provide insight into associated uncertainties. It should also have a sufficient level of flexibility, allowing for incorporation of new knowledge and new technologies. And last but not least, it should be a system that is understandable, because that is really key for building confidence with end users. Therefore, the ASPIS cluster decided to develop a well-guided workflow to make a significant contribution to the operationalization of next-generation risk assessment. And we named this workflow ASPA, the ASPIS-initiated Alternative Safety Profiling Algorithm. You may or may not like the name, but what is more important to know is that this workflow serves as a guidance on data generation and data interpretation. meaning that the workflow defines a tiered approach on what tools, methods, names one should use. It informs you at which steps one should generate and evaluate data, including uncertainty assessment. It informs on how to put data into the context of a hazard or risk assessment scenario, and it defines a decision logic with one entry but multiple exit points, activating the steps that are needed for the problem formulation at hand. In terms of scope, it is important to note that the projects in the ASPIS cluster, being Risk Hunter, OnTox, and Precision Tox, focus on systemic adverse health effects due to chronic exposure. And therefore, the focus of ASPA is also on systemic toxicity. However, we take a somewhat wider perspective to avoid the need of separate workflows for next generation risk assessment covering other health effects, other exposure scenarios. And I also would like to highlight the fact that ASPA is applicable for different regulatory frameworks and for different regulatory questions. Before diving into the details of ASPA, I would like to show you its generic outline. More specifically, I would like to highlight with this graphic that the well-known building blocks of human health risk assessment are still in place. We start at the top with the bright green block. And this green block is about the problem formulation of the risk assessment at hand. Here one defines the regulatory question that needs to be addressed, the regulation that applies, the available resources, as well as the available time. The next steps are divided into 3 pillars: hazard, ADME, and exposure. And I don't expect you here to read all the text. I mainly want to convey the message that we aim for a tiered approach. So that's why each of the pillars is subdivided into an upper and a lower part. And the yellow blocks in each of these tiers indicate how the resulting information could be used in a risk assessment context. Obviously, all information and data is then combined to result in an outcome or multiple outcomes that address the regulatory question as defined in the problem formulation. So before showing you the latest version of the ASPA, I would like to spend a few words on the design of ASPA. Now, for its design, we make use of building blocks and decision points as main elements. And each of the elements has its own unique identifier, analogous to, for example, the AOP wiki. And this identifier is used to link to dedicated guidance, which is provided in addition to more overarching guidance. And the dedicated guidance comprises, first of all, a description of the element, explaining in more detail what is exactly meant by that building block or decision point. In addition, we provide actual guidance that should be taken into account, such as guidance from OECD, ECHA, or APSA. And furthermore, the dedicated guidance will be complemented with examples to showcase how one should apply a certain step in the workflow. Another aspect related to the design of ASPA is that we have incorporated workflows into the ASPA workflow. So one could say we have added an extra layer to the ASPA. And we chose to do so because we sometimes encountered the need for delineating a certain step at a much greater granularity compared to the other steps. We realized, however, that adding all those details to the same layer of ASPA would make ASPA unnecessarily complex. And so therefore we chose to use a bright yellow element instead, as shown here in the figure. And so these bright yellow boxes actually represent a workflow in itself. So, and this is what the latest version of ASPA, namely version 2.0, looks like. Again, it starts at the top with this bright green box, the problem formulation, and you may at the same time also recognize the bright yellow boxes I just talked about. So, and if we then zoom in a little bit, and I don't expect you to be able to read the text in the individual boxes, but I hope you do recognize that we have organized the different elements into 3 different pillars. So on the far left, you find the hazard pillar, in the middle, the ADME pillar, and on the far right, the exposure pillars. And even though we have organized the elements into these pillars, I reckon that you agree with me that this workflow is already fairly complex. And it's to be expected that its complexity will increase with its further development. And that makes it far from attractive to apply for any end user. Therefore, we have, in parallel to the ASPA, developed an electronic dashboard to facilitate the actual application of the ASPA. And so, dependent on the problem formulation at hand, the dashboard walks you through the steps of ASPA that are applicable for your regulatory question, and it incorporates the available guidance and example. And the dashboard closely follows the ASPA, meaning that any updates to the ASPA made are swiftly incorporated into the dashboard. With the development of ASPA, we aim to provide a significant contribution to bringing next generation risk assessment to life. Obviously, it takes more than a workflow alone. So therefore, within the ASPIS cluster, we are performing different case studies to demonstrate the applicability of ASPA for regulatory purposes. And together, these case studies cover different regulatory frameworks and different regulatory questions, ranging from prioritization to classification and labeling to full risk assessment. So we will deliver a next generation risk assessment workflow accompanied by an electronic platform to facilitate its application, well-described examples of next generation risk assessment to be reported as OECD IATA case studies, as well as transparent reports describing what works well and what still needs to be improved. So with that, I hope you now have a better understanding of what ASPA involves. And if you want to study it in more detail, then please go ahead and scan the QR code shown here on the screen. I also want to inform you that we are developing the ASPA in an online software tool, and anyone can comment on that. So if you would like to do so, then please drop me a message and I can share the link to this online software tool with you. More importantly, I would like to inform you that we update the ASPA at scheduled intervals, and the next update is due in January 2025. Before I close, I would like to acknowledge all people here listed on the screen, especially Marcel Leist and Georgia Paloka from the University of Constance, who conceived the idea of a next generation risk assessment workflow. And besides all the partners that are in the Risk Hunter project, I obviously want to thank you for your attention.